A British rights group has filed a second legal application calling on the UK government to remove the Palestinian resistance group Hamas from a list of proscribed terrorist organizations. The organization Cage International said it had instructed lawyers to appeal the decision in 2021 by former UK Home Secretary Priti Patel to proscribe Hamas in its entirety. The proscription of Hamas predates its current battle with Israel in Gaza, where the group has been the de facto authority since winning the Palestinian elections in 2006. Joining us now, I'd like to welcome Anas Musthapha, who's the head of public advocacy at Cage. Anas, assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and shukran so much for joining us.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Okay, Anas, so a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to Fahd Ansari, who is, of course, one of the lawyers that is bringing another case, or the first case, to the British government. So is this part of the case, or is this a separate one that is currently being brought?
This is a separate legal case. The law in which organizations are prescribed under allows for appeals to be made on two main grounds, you could say. First, the organizations that are impacted themselves are allowed to appeal, and hence Riverway Law's application 2 months ago was instructed by the Palestinian group Hamas itself. This application that we have submitted this week is on the basis that the law allows for those impacted by proscription, directly or indirectly, to submit an application to the Home Secretary here, requiring or requesting that the prescription be reviewed, and that's the basis. So it's a separate application, but on a similar issue.
Anas, let's talk about obviously where this is heading to. We've got the UK, the UK government, of course, who has changed its tune in the last 2 weeks, whether or not it's to be believed by the public, both within the United Kingdom and, of course, across the world, is going to be quite interesting. But what is the legal proceedings to try and have Hamas removed from a terrorist organization within the United Kingdom? For those, of course, who are living under the rock, they just want to get the understanding, given that, of course, immediately when Hamas came into power in mid-2000, they were already proscribed as the terrorist organization in the United Kingdom and various other Western countries.
Actually, just to correct you there, when Hamas came into power back in 2006, they were actually they were not proscribed. In 2001, the British government has prescribed Izz-ad-Din Qassam brigades as the military wing of Hamas, as a terrorist organization, but had maintained that the political wing of the party remains a legitimate party that can be engaged with, and hence why Hamas officials used to conduct meetings and interviews with British civil society organizations over many years. However, since 2021, the Priti Patel, former Home Secretary, who'd actually lost her ministerial position as a result of illegal or unsanctioned visits to Israel and discussions with Netanyahu's government at the time, she pushed for the proscription of the entirety of the organization. So since 2021, and the UK has sort of reviewed or revised or changed 20-year long-standing policy of not proscribing Hamas. Now, what that has created is meant that any individuals who are supportive of the organization, any individuals who may arrange meetings for that organization, any individuals who may glorify some of its activities or actions, risk facing arrest and prosecution and perhaps up to 14 years imprisonment under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act 2000. So it's quite a serious offense. And much more broader, what it has enabled, the proscription of Hamas has enabled the wide-scale repression of the pro-Palestine movement, because any activity that is done for the Palestinian cause is very easily maligned and twisted and framed as an activity which is adjacent to terrorism or supportive of a terrorist entity or terrorist activities. And that's what we've seen. We've seen even leaders of the pro-Palestine, mainstream pro-Palestine movement in the UK sort of arrested and investigated under sort of terrorism powers. And we've seen even some of the more radical elements of the movement in the UK as well investigated under terrorism powers. We've seen even lay people mothers and fathers, and even young children, as listed and documented in our application, which has upwards of 20 examples, being investigated or threatened with investigation under terrorism powers simply because of their pro-Palestine advocacy. So our application, what it seeks to do, it seeks to carve out a space in the public debate to allow people to discuss the issue of Palestine without fear of prosecution, without fear of them facing serious prison time, and also change the dynamic on the ground and push back against some of the aggressive tactics of the state and of the pro-Zionist movement here.
Anas, I want to touch on the Section 12 of the Terrorism Act 2000. You've mentioned it, of course, in the first answer, but I want to touch briefly on that, because just reading your statement here, it says, the submission is the first of its kind, not focusing only on the procedural injustice, but on the systematic suppression of political speech, particularly within Britain's Muslim communities. It highlights the weaponization of Section 12 of the Terrorism Act of 2000 against pro-Palestine advocacy. We have seen, of course, this happening within the United Kingdom, the suppression that has occurred. It, of course, took a much bigger take on it, a much bigger suppression of it when, of course, July the 7th, 2005 had happened. Talk to us about this section right here and how it's being used to really hardly suppress many of those pro-Palestine supporters.
So Section 12 of the Terrorism Act 2000 is a very broad piece of legislation. It essentially outlaws any expressions of support for prescribed organizations. And that expression of support could be support which is explicit and very direct, and it could be stuff even done recklessly so. And the law actually specifies even activities that are done recklessly so that may be interpreted by members of the public as being supportive of an organization. So it's pretty much like a catch-all piece of law that enables a broad array of activities to be targeted by it. And it doesn't really matter whether an individual ends up being convicted under Section 12 powers, but merely allowing the police to have those powers and to charge or investigate someone on that basis. It gives them right to raid their home, it gives them right to access their devices, it gives them right to demand the passwords and look into their communications, and it essentially turn their life upside down and examine it with a sort of like a toothpick. So often, even if there isn't any evidence of any criminal activity, any illegal activity, something may come up. For example, there's a case that we were supporting of an academic who's been involved in research here in the UK, I believe in the medicinal fields, and following a Schedule 7 stop, which is a stop again under terrorism powers that doesn't require any suspicion, and they can hold someone for up to 6 hours, and they must answer all of their questions. They do not have the right to remain silent, and if you remain silent, then you risk to being arrested and charged as a terrorist. It's a quite scary piece of legislation. They managed to access his phone and his devices and found that on a group chat sometime, months before, he'd happened to share a document that was published by Hamas, explaining explaining some of the intentions behind some of the things that they've done around October 7th. And this was done in the context of sharing information and sharing news and updates. And this document was shared broadly across mainstream and other media. And because of that, his visa was revoked. So people are facing serious consequences because terrorism powers enable the police to access into your life, to enable them to raid your home, to turn your life upside down. And even if you're not convicted on those powers, the effect of it, which is to scare people off, to silence them, is achieved regardless. And that's what we're seeing, is that whilst not everyone is being arrested and convicted under terrorism powers, but enough people are to scare off the rest.
Anas, we're going to be taking a short break. We're going to continue this conversation after this. I'm speaking to Anas Musthapha, who is the head of public advocacy at Cage 2. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm in conversation with Anas Musthapha, the head of public advocacy at Cage. Anas, again, shukran so much for staying with us. Anas, in the statement, of course, Cage had highlighted 24 case studies spanning 6 sectors, highlighting systematic harm. I'm not going to go through each of these case studies, but there's one that I specifically want to touch on, and that is children. I mean, children as young as 8 referred to or threatened with referral to prevent expressing solidarity with Palestine. So I just want to get this correction, and maybe you could speak to it. In United Kingdom schools, if a child as young as 8 is showing solidarity for Palestine, for example, speaking out of the children that are being killed as this genocide in Gaza continues, when they see the children being killed by Israeli occupation forces in the occupied West Bank, is it as simple as saying that they are being either disciplined or some sort of harm is being done to them just for expressing what it is to be a humanitarian?
I mean, you've hit the nail on the head there. Unfortunately, it's schools in the United Kingdom have been forced since at least 2015 to monitor their students, essentially an extension of the role of the police and the role of the intelligence services, to monitor their students and to check on their views and their opinions. And if they express views and opinions that are deemed to be, extreme, quote unquote, then these kids must be treated in a different way. And often it leads to referral to a counterterrorism, de-radicalization or counter-extremism program. And that involves a host of other interventions on family life and disruption, and kids finding themselves put on sort of surveillance lists of the police and worse. So, however, there's been serious campaigning against its power, and it's perhaps one of the most maligned and hated pieces of legislation across the board, and widely and broadly condemned by Muslim organizations across the board and by mainstream human rights organizations. And that's a testament to the Muslim community's sort of activism and pushback against it. And we've seen this piece of legislation being weaponized once again against pro-Palestine activism in schools. So the example that you cite of children, there's an 8-year-old child who was actually from Palestine himself, from Gaza. He'd lost relatives in Gaza in the current genocide and had stitched a Palestine flag onto his jacket. And as a result, he was turned back from school. His parents were threatened that they are demonstrating overt political opinions, whilst a child which required empathy, which required some degree of appreciating and understanding the grief that they're going through, was treated through sort of a policing lens by their school, which is extremely unfortunate and sort of really an indictment of the current situation that we find ourselves in, and how some schools unfortunately have behaved so poorly in response to the current ensuing genocide and to current heavily sort of politicized pressure that schools are facing. There are other schools which have behaved much more aligned with human values and empathy and have supported the Palestinian cause, but there are others which have unfortunately succumbed to the pressure from central government. Now, with this child, as a result of their parents protesting this decision of the school and a result of other parents also intervening on their behalf, they were threatened with their child being referred to this counter-terrorism, counter-extremism sort of program for children. And this is just one case of hundreds of others that we are working on as an organization. I mean, since the 7th of October, our work has increased many folds, over 200-300% increase in our work. And mostly those individuals have come to us because they're being targeted and being perhaps sometimes losing jobs or suspended from their work, or perhaps being investigated by local authorities or by police because of their pro-Palestine advocacy, unfortunately.
And there's obviously an end to the 24 case studies, but of course the statement ends with, Cage's evidence reveals that prosecutions and disciplinary actions are overwhelmingly directed at Muslims, often triggered by bad faith actors and amplified by a politicized regulatory environment. The submission argues this amounts to a discriminatory application of the law, contrary to Article 14. What we've also seen is that many non-Muslim protesters who, of course, are in solidarity with Palestine are probably facing the same fate that many of the Muslim citizens of the United Kingdom face. So I think there's a lot of pressure that's going to be on the United government, isn't it, given that when you look at solidarity for Palestine, it's not just Muslims that are doing it. More non-Muslims are getting involved and are making their voices heard.
Yeah, I mean the pro-Palestine movement is a broad movement that involves people from all walks of life. And if you see any of those mass marches that happen quite often on the streets of London, you'll see people from every single background, faith, culture on those demonstrations. So very much so. I mean, it's not. It is sort of uniquely Muslim issue with only Muslims mobilizing for it. No, it's the completely the opposite. But obviously, as an advocacy group that's born out of the Muslim community and that one that sort of campaigns against the discrimination and against the discriminatory impacts of counterterrorism powers, especially, it's important for us to note that despite this reality, Muslims still find themselves as unfortunately the main targets of this repression, and that's not to exclude others. In fact, numerous of our clients happen to be, non-Muslims, white British sort of people who've faced similar consequences for their principled support of Palestine.
Anas, one final question. When I spoke to Fahd Ansari, he said that, look, all the evidence that has been brought, all the necessity to convince Home Secretary Yvette Cooper to have this proscription of Hamas is there. From Cage's perspective, how much confidence does this organization have that Yvette Cooper would not succumb just to the politicization of what is happening, but look at it from a sensible perspective that Hamas are the legitimate government of Gaza, and the fight that they are taking to the Israeli army is done in accordance with the United Nations, which says there can be armed resistance to an occupying power?
I mean, the British government just needs to look at its own track record. Just 3-4 years ago, this organization was not proscribed. So what has changed so drastically in the last 4 or 5 years that required this change? This is a political decision that was done by a radical and extreme element within the Conservative Party, and unfortunately the new Labour administration has just doubled down on it. We believe that this will be a slightly drawn-out legal battle. We know that it will reach to the proscribed organisation Appeals Commission, which is the oversight quasi-judicial body that has the right to compel the Home Secretary to review its decisions and to change the designation of organisations. And I am sure that whether it's Cage, whether it's River Law, or any other actors who may submit applications for the deproscription of Hamas in defense of the Palestine movement here in the UK and more broadly globally, I'm sure that they're ready for the fight and they will take it to as far as they can get to.
Anas, absolute pleasure having you, and shukran so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
That's Anas Musthapha. He's the head of public advocacy at Cage. Of course, Cage, Riverway Law, I beg your pardon, to organizations hoping to have Hamas removed as a terrorist organization in the United Kingdom. Well, that's all we have for you here on News in Focus. On Monday, we will be having a Youth Day special. Do stay tuned to that at 8 o'clock. Until then, do have yourself a good weekend, but most importantly, a safe one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.